Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to INSS English Podcast. I'm Adi Kantor. Since the 8th of October 2023, a day after the atrocious massacre of more than 1,500 Israeli Jews by Hamas terrorists in the coordinated armed incursions from the Gaza Strip into the Gaza envelope of southern Israel, Israel and Hezbollah have been engaged in an intense war of attrition, which seems to have picked up speed in recent weeks and is accompanied by increasing expressions of threats by both sides. These threatening declarations make clear that in the case of an all-out war, the citizens of Israel will indeed find themselves in a whole new situation, one which they were not familiar with, and alongside unprecedented number of casualties. Despite the fact that the main arena in which the IDF operates remains the Gaza Strip, it seems that the weight is gradually shifting towards Israel's northern border. How close is Israel to an all-out war in the north? What scenarios should be taken under considerations, and what are the implications of such a war? Is there still a chance to reach a diplomatic agreement, one which will bring back the security to tens of thousands of Israelis deported from their homes and finally enable them to come back? And what is the role of Syria in the ongoing escalation between Israel and Lebanon? To answer these questions in depth, with me in the INSS studio today is Dr. Carmit Valensi, senior researcher at the INSS and head of the Northern Arena program. Carmit specializes in contemporary Middle East affairs, strategic studies, military concepts, and terrorism, and her work on these subjects has appeared in academic and professional publications. She's also the co-author of the book Syrian Requiem, The Civil War and Its Aftermath, published in Princeton University in 2021. Carmit, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today for this alarming talk.
Thank you, Adi.
So let us begin with Lebanon. We are everybody who's watching the news can witness a very tensed talk, escalating talk about the threats of a total war. What direction is Israel headed regarding this subject?
So clearly, as you just mentioned, the war of attrition we've been conducting with Hezbollah over the past 8 months has intensified dramatically, as both sides escalating their military efforts, their military campaign, stepping up their military campaign. Israel on its side striking harder against Hezbollah, killing senior commanders, attacking deeper into Lebanon. And Hezbollah, in turn, also increased its attacks against Israel, launching more and more attacking drones towards Israel, launching more missiles, Burkan rockets, and other means. So obviously the situation is an escalation trend. However, it's not just the military effort, as you mentioned in your opening remark. We also can identify an escalation in the level of messages, the warning messages, the threatening messages that each sides of and the public statement that each side's basically carrying since the past few weeks. So, for instance, Hezbollah last week released a 9-minute video showing surveillance drones patrolling over northern Israel. Israel, on its side, some Israeli officials, stated that the country is well prepared to an all-out war with Hezbollah, and also that a military offensive operation against Hezbollah was approved. So clearly, we can identify an escalation in the situation. I think that as long as the current situation continues under the same characteristics, the risk for a miscalculation dramatically increased. So this is something that we should take into account. It seems that lately the Israeli public, puts a greater pressure on Israeli decision makers to resolve the current situation and to allow the Israeli evacuees to return to their homes. So generally speaking, there are more signs today among the Israeli public as well as Israeli officials that it's time to launch a sort of a military campaign that will allow us to push Hezbollah back from our northern border. And this is something that we should clearly think whether this is the right timing to launch a full-scale war against Hezbollah. Are these
when
the
we
right...
both know that it's not just against Hezbollah.
Exactly. Are these the right circumstances, or we should keep it into a more convenient time? So this is one question which we should...
What would you say is the logic that accompanies, and let's now focus on Israel, when observing what is happening in the northern border? What is the logic that Israel is directed with? What accompanies the logic of the government?
Yeah, surprisingly, there is logic of both sides that characterize the operation on both sides and the entire campaign. And I would say that in spite of the intensity, despite of the fragility of the situation, the current conflict has been conducting under sort of specific rules of engagement on both sides. And let me say, give you several examples for this kind of rules. So first of all, from the very beginning, both sides aim to control the escalation and to keep it below the threshold of war. And this is as an assumption that we need to revise under the current circumstances that we've just described. But the main goal was to launch a military attack on both sides, but to keep it again below the threshold of war.
But who decides what's the threshold of what? I mean, we see all the time this threshold increases more and more. And who decides in the end what will be on the ground? Because it seems as if Hezbollah is the one who decides what will be tomorrow in the next 2 days.
I think that Hezbollah leading the situation and leading the direction of things was I agree with you, but it was at the beginning of the war. But something has changed in the Israeli reaction. So from the beginning, Nasrallah said it quite clearly on every speech he carried since the beginning of the war, dictated an equation. He liked to talk in terms of equations. So he said that the current equation is tit for tat, army against army, blood for blood, and we will not, escalate as long as Israel will keep it, again, only against military targets as well.
Even though we see that they are hitting also civilian targets.
But according to them, this is a retaliation due to Israeli strikes against civilian targets. So they only react to Israeli action on this term. But as you said, that it's a very fragile situation. This is one element in this equation that I've mentioned. But the most prominent, within these rules of engagement we were talking, the most prominent issue is the linkage that Nasrallah has created, again, from the very beginning of the conflict between the two fronts, between Gaza and Lebanon. So according to him, as long as the war in Gaza continues, the fire from Lebanon will continue as well. We'll only see the end of this conflict only when Israel will end the war in Gaza. The problem is that the current Israeli government is not willing to end the war in Gaza anytime soon, before it will achieve its strategic goals. So this
has it always been, by the way, like this? That Nasrallah is so committed to Sinwar?
Well, I think
Is it really Gaza what is interesting Nasrallah, or maybe something beyond?
It's much more beyond. Of course, it has it's a commitment to the Gaza front, to the Palestinian issue. It's been always an important issue in the eyes of Nasrallah. But today, Nasrallah views himself as the head of the radical axis. And a prominent component of this axis is the Palestinians. It's not just Hezbollah and Syria and
everybody
all the proxies
controlled by Iran.
So, as the head of this axis, he has to, demonstrate his capability, as to demonstrate his responsibility over the action of the axis. Therefore, is joining this campaign again. So far, in a limited scale. This is not a full-scale war. Yet between Hezbollah
Even though,
and Israel.
For us Israelis, when we know that there are tens of thousands of Israelis who are not in their homes right now and are spread in hotels, their homes are being bombed, missiles are launched towards their homes. It seems as if a war has already started, but not in a scale that you are now talking about. So in what scenario do you think, what is the worst scenario that will indeed bring to an all-out war? What should happen for that?
So I think that further escalation that will eventually drag us into a full-scale war could happen under two circumstances, either by unintended escalation, like a miscalculation, and it seems that this is the direction that we're heading now.
It can happen also to the Israeli side, by the way, a miscalculation.
Yeah, of course. In such a tense time, and with not everything is certain to us, and a lot of question marks, especially the way we understand the other side, especially after the October 7. We keep, questioning ourselves, what are the other side intentions? So things could be, interpreted in the wrong way, and that could lead to escalation on both sides. This is one scenario. The second scenario would be a deliberate decision, an intended decision to initiate a wider military campaign, not necessarily a full-scale war, but even a limited military campaign against Hezbollah. And according to some reports, Israel is heading that way.
What does it mean, a limited campaign?
Well, it's a good question. We're not
How
sure about the details.
Will there be?
It's not. It's good that we're not fully aware to the details, because it should keep confidential. But the intention is to significantly harm Hezbollah's infrastructure, Hezbollah weapons arsenal, without...
And seniors.
Exactly, and targeting seniors as well, without escalating into a full-scale war, keeping it in a limited manner. The question how we do that. Can we really control this escalation? Can we really control how the other side will decide to react? So this is something that is very dangerous.
Said very specifically and very clearly that in a case that Israel engages into a war, Hezbollah will invade the northern border.
Exactly. He said a few days ago, and this is something that we should also take into account, that while thinking about something limited, it could easily deteriorate into a full-scale war. And as you clearly mentioned, it's not going to be just Hezbollah this time, but we're talking about multi-front conflict, and this is another...
Netanyahu mentioned, by the way, a few days ago, 7 fronts. Israel is fighting 7 fronts at the moment.
Yeah, I think that this is it's not a new pattern. I mean, we faced it in a much more limited manner in previous conflict, including in May 2021 in the Guardian of
the Walls.
But this is a different scenario, and I would even say further, in the case of a full scale between Israel and Hezbollah, I think that we'll see the other components of the radical axis are much more involved, heavily involved. We're going to talk about Syria in a few minutes. So the things I think from that theater will be much more dangerous comparing to now.
Carmit, in your view, how much is Israel prepared for a scenario like this, of a total war with Hezbollah?
So that's a good question. I think and I hope that our decision makers take into account all the consideration and understand the challenges that we're going to face. It's going to be we're talking about significant damages and losses on both sides, not only, of course, Israel, but also in terms of the losses and harms in Lebanon.
Which is clear that the Israeli home front has not yet seen a scenario like that, not even imagined.
Yeah, because Hezbollah has focused and put greater effort in its military force build-up, and since 2006, and now he owns a larger arsenal of missiles, and with a particular emphasis on precision-guided missiles. And Nasrallah keeps bragging about this capability and his ability to target...
And film also Israeli targets.
Exactly.
Yeah. Strategic targets.
Targets, basic infrastructure like water, electricity. We've just were exposed to a loud debate in Israel in the past few days about our preparedness, about our capability to absorb such a blow hitting one of our electricity infrastructure. So there is a debate in Israel about the level of preparedness, about the level we're well prepared exactly to this kind of scenario. I think that after 8 months of fighting in the Gaza front and dealing with multiple challenges, I think it would be much better for us to keep in mind all the consequences of such a, negative consequences of such a large-scale war with Hezbollah. Perhaps it's inevitable. It's the only way to
keep Radwan force, as far as possible from the border.
And to create, in general speaking, to create a better security, to improve the security situation in the north, is by launching a full-scale war with Hezbollah. But again, I'm posing a huge question mark about whether this is the right timing.
Yes. Do you think there is still a chance of reaching a diplomatic agreement? Going back somehow to 1701? So
again, the biggest challenge is the connection between the two fronts that Nasrallah clearly committed to. So as long as we're going to continue fighting in Gaza,
we're going to continue seeing the drones flying in.
Several times we will not go into negotiations. Even we'll not go into negotiations with Israel as long as the war continues. But once if we'll surprisingly reach a ceasefire in Gaza or sort of an agreement in Gaza, I believe that their chances are much higher to reach a diplomatic solution in the north. I think both sides has larger incentives today to reach a diplomatic solution instead of, dragging into the other option of dragging into a full-scale war. So I think it's realistic and possible and
Depends
doable.
On what happens on the ground.
Depends on what happens on the ground. The challenge now is to keep this conflict below the threshold of war until we reach settlement.
To control the level of fire. It's very interesting to see how both sides are saying all the time how they are not interested in the war and are so coming close to it day by day. This is a dissonance of its own. We're gonna depart now from discussing about Lebanon, and let's talk a bit about Syria. The neighboring country. So how do you think the war in the last 9 months of war between Israel and Gaza has affected what we see in Syria? We have not seen, it has always been a front, but we don't see so much happening there, visible at least. So how do you explain that?
Right, and this is a very interesting question. Comparing to all the other challenges that we've been confronting in the past 8 or 9 months, the situation, the clashes from the Syrian theater are much more contained and limited. And we've been asking ourselves, how come Bashar al-Assad, the president, didn't decide to join is a major component of this radical axis. How come he decided not to join this conflict and to join it more actively? So I think it stems from several reasons. First of all, Assad, as we know, only cares about his own survivability. And after 13 years of civil war, of surviving these multiple challenges that he had to face throughout the war, is not willing to jeopardize his position and neither Syria's relative stability. So therefore, he chooses not to enter into this conflict. A second explanation has to do with Assad relations with Hamas, the historical rivalry between the parties. And let me remind you that at the beginning of the civil war in Syria, Hamas criticized Assad for his brutal suppression, ironically, of its opponent, and criticized him for killing Palestinians in Syria. They cut off relations. And even though they reconciled a few years ago, Assad still hasn't forgot the criticism and the betrayal of Hamas. Therefore, there's a question, why should he sacrifice his own, again, survivability in his own country for the sake of the Palestinian, for the sake of Hamas? And thirdly, perhaps it wasn't Assad's decision. Perhaps it's something that came all the way, a decision that came all the way from Tehran or from Hezbollah, from the leaders of the radical axis, prioritizing to preserve Assad, to preserve Syria, which is a key component of the radical axis, both in terms of its role in the axis, to keep it to other circumstances or other future conflicts much more significant between Israel, either between Israel and Hezbollah or between Israel and Iran. Mm-hmm. So they need to keep Syria quiet now in order to allow themselves to use it more prominently in the future.
Even though when we say quiet, we need to keep to always remember that there are weapon shipments being conducted
Of course.
from Syrian ground. So they are part of some kind of escalation. But this has been going also, of course, a lot before the war. So
Yeah, and also there are some shootings from Syria every once in a while, sporadic shootings from Syria, but most of them attributed to either Shiite militias or Palestinian factions who operate in Syria, not to the Assad army and the Assad regime. And you asked me about the consequences of the war. Even though Syria's role in this war is limited, we can identify how the war in Gaza impacts several aspects in Syria. So first of all, what we've been seeing since October 7 has to do with the war or not, but we clearly see an escalation in the internal violence, internal clashes and conflicts in Syria among different factors, starting from, Assad regime and along with the Russian targeting more aggressively in Idlib, the rebels in Idlib in northwest Syria, more clashes between Turkey and the Kurds community in Syria. ISIS has stepped up its military campaign against the regime, probably taking advantage of the fact that the regional and international focus is directed to Gaza. Perhaps could be one explanation. And the Druze community is more active in its demonstration against the regime. So very unstable situation in Syria in parallel to the war in Gaza. This is one aspect. As you mentioned, when it comes to Iran, we saw it clearly at the beginning of the war that it intensified its weapons transfer all the way from Iran via Syria to Hezbollah. In response, Israel increased its attacks, its military attacks and strikes against Iranian assets and Axis assets in Syria. And that surprisingly led to the evacuation or the withdrawal of some Iranian and Hezbollah operatives from the Syrian soil into Lebanon in order to protect them or to avoid, risks. So, that was a very interesting development. However, Iran is, it's important to emphasize that Iran is going to it's not going anywhere. It's going to stay in Syria in the long run. It's still,
aspirations are very clear. Yes. The Iranian aspirations have grown also in the past month. This is clear.
And we also can identify a certain and interesting change in Russia's behavior. So obviously Russia is a very dominant actor in the past few years in Syria. However, due to the war in Ukraine, it has to reduce some of its involvement, some of its activity in Syria. But when it comes to the Israeli strikes, so far it was quite tolerated, Russia. But we can identify a certain change in its behavior in the past few months. And since January this year, we started to see a very interesting move by Russia, starting to patrol its aircraft in southern Syria, patrolling over the Bravo line, the ceasefire line between Israel and Syria, establishing more observation posts there, about 5 new observation posts. And what is the cause? It's a great question. I think it's a symbolic move that aimed to signal Israel that we're here. We're monitoring the situation, hence we expect you to be more moderate in your attacks. This is just symbolically. So far, we haven't seen anything more aggressive, but this is something that we should also be aware of.
Very interesting. What would you recommend, as a final question, as our time is almost up, what would you recommend the Israeli government to do regarding Syria? How to continue the same situation? What would you say would be clever to do in the next months?
This is a good question, and I think we should definitely think about a revised strategy towards Syria in light of what happened on October 7. I think that we all bear the trauma of October 7, and this laid the ground for the understanding that we cannot live with a gun to our heads near our border, that we cannot live with a continuous military threat on our borders, and it also applies to the Syrian border. So I can assume that one of the options that will be raised, talking about the Israeli strategy in Syria, will be to step up the military, the campaign between wars, the military campaign that Israel has been launching in the last decade in Syria. And to perhaps even to keep some of the rules of engagement, the new rules of engagement we adopted throughout this war, including targeting Hezbollah operatives, Iranian operatives. We saw how one of these targeted killing resulted in April 14. but perhaps to adopt a more aggressive approach when it comes to the Iranian entrenchment and assets in Syria. This is one direction. I think it's not enough. I think that the current situation, the regional threats, the multiple front threats that we're facing require us to think outside the box and to think how can we leverage our relations with the other countries in the region in order to tackle this challenge of the Iranian entrenchment in Syria. We need to think more in terms of regional coalitions. It's not just a military issue. Iran concerns a lot of parties in the Middle East and, of course, the U.S., and we should harness those elements in order to better cope with this threat, not only through military means, but also using diplomatic, soft power means, and, we can elaborate.
Not think that we are better off alone, but rather to cooperate and find more partners for alliances. That would be a good sentence to finish our podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Carmit Valensi, for enlightening us on such a burning and interesting subject, such as the Northern Front. And let's hope it remains as quiet as possible.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our viewers. See you next time.